Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 150 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In the last episode, we got crystals all set up, at least as far as we could. Train got partially filled up, but we're out of dust. We could generate some more, but I'm going to leave this for now since we don't need a ton of crystals in the short term, and see how it works. And if we need to make some dust, we can make some dust. The primary way of making it is through geodes, and we can make geodes by washing heavy mud water, and it generates quite a few. So that's a pretty easy way to do it. But another way is with growing these various farm items. It's kind of interesting how they provide a little bit of crystal dust, but they do. So that's another option. But one thing I'm a little concerned about is our lack of seeds. Now we do have some choices. Like we have 4 out of the 5 types here and 4 out of the 5 types here, but only 2 types here. And in general, we just don't have very much farm science packs here. So I would like to get back to generating some gardens. We used to do it way back here when we were using this phosphorus ore, but it hasn't been on in a long time. So I would like to cover all the various garden things you can do. And we could take farming too down a little bit here, where we gain a second way of making soil from washed sand, but it requires twice as much compost as mud, so mud is definitely better. But if you got a lot of sand, I guess you can do it this way. And we could make fertilizer by mixing compost with urea, and make some biological active tiles if we wanted to. But we'll grab that, and then that unlocks the second tier of fertilizer. I don't know what you'd call it. I call it chemical fertilizer, because it requires nitric acid, ammonia gas, and urea gas, and no compost. So it's definitely efficient in that sense. And this is the Bob's recipe for using fertilizer to make more trees. But we'll grab that. Then we can drop down a step further into alien farming. It allows us to make polluted fish water from raw meat if we wanted to do it that way. This is much less efficient than just growing the fish and doing the air quotes petting and letting them produce the fish water that way. But if you've got raw meat left over and you want to get rid of it, this is a good way to do it. And we can take the alien bacteria that we're producing and turn it into alien goo, which when we mix with a fertilizer gives us alienated fertilizer. And then that unlocks another method of producing gardens where you add plant life and that alien fertilizer, and you could take one garden and turn it into 2. So I'll cover kind of all the garden generation and consumption types in a second, because there's kind of a lot you can do with gardens. So exactly what you want to do kind of dictates which processes you use. But we can grab that, and any steps further are going to require that farming science. So I don't want to go too far. Like one thing we can do is use fertilizer to make trees more efficiently. And it also unlocks the crystal-tipped saw blade, which is one of the few uses for the harmonic crystal splinter. But basically, it just makes the saw blades last longer. But our tree setup is working fine for now, so I don't see any reason to tear it apart just to upgrade it a little bit, so we can leave that. Plus, I don't know how much science we have left over before we're going to run out. But if you take this a step further, it now unlocks the different environment farms. So if you take some of that alien plant life sample, which is a reason why we'd want to collect a bunch of it, is because we're going to need it, you can make a desert environment kit, which then goes into a basic farm and other components to make a desert farm. And the desert farm can only make desert items, as you would expect, but it's twice as fast as a generic farm. That's kind of a cool way of having higher tier machines, that instead of the machines doing more things like they do with ore sorting with angels, they do less things because they become more specialized, and that seems to make more sense. That's kind of a neat way of how that works. And it also unlocks another method of obtaining seeds. Basically, it's more efficient at making seeds, but you don't get any plant life samples out of it. And if we take it a step further down here, we get to the rarer food types. So I don't know if we're going to be able to research all these things, but I'll hit them for now. because we will want to use these special types of farms. So the swamp farm just requires the swamp kits, and the temperate farms require the temperate kits. So we'll grab all of that, and we'll see how it works while it's researching pretty quickly. At least that part is. Once we start requiring agricultural science facts, though, this might slow down really fast. Well, while that's going, I'm going to cover all the things you can do with gardens. So we'll just use the temperate garden right here. Well, it's going pretty fast. Barely started talking, and it's already going nuts here, but we're running out of science. But I don't know. We'll see what it does. So let's say you have a garden, and you want to get rid of it. Well, the question is, do you want seeds, or do you want plant life? Because you can use the advanced seed extraction to get only seeds, and a fairly high percentage of the rarer seeds. But if you don't care about getting a lot of seeds, but you want some, and you want plant life, you could do the standard extraction, which you see cuts the yield of seeds in half, but gives you half alien plant life samples of 16. And then what happens if you don't care about seeds at all? Well, then you can do the alien plant life sample generation here, where you get only samples. 32. So, if you've got gardens, you've got those three choices about how to make them disappear. And also that kind of explains how you have two different methods of getting seeds. Well, what happens if you want to create gardens? Well, you have a couple choices there too, kind of depending on the situation that you're in. So if you've got nothing, you can use compost, fertilizer, and water. That recipe is a little different depending on the garden you want. But you put a ton of that stuff, as you see, a 500 of each there, and then 1,000 seconds of crafting time, and you can generate a garden out of nothing. So that's a good way of getting the process started, or to keep it going if you don't have any resources. Well, what happens if you have a little bit of alien plant life, and you don't particularly care about what it turns into? You can use this garden cultivation here, which uses one sample to generate a 1% chance of getting a garden. Now, this is not a way of generating gardens. It will produce less gardens than the plant life goes in, ultimately. But if you've got plant life and you want to turn it into gardens, this is a reasonable way to do it. And it doesn't require very much alien plant life, as you see, just the one. So what happens if you've already got a garden and you've got alien plant life? Well, you can do the new recipe we're researching here, where you add the alien fertilizer and some other liquid to turn one garden into two. So you can see how you would use this to create your first garden if you needed to. And you'd probably have to create a few because you need the alien plant life, but once you have enough alien plant life, you can use a garden and turn it into two gardens. And since each garden can produce 32 plant life samples, this will generate gardens because it requires less than that. So it might seem a little slow, and in a way it kind of is, because it requires 30 out of 32 plant life to create a garden. So only 2 out of that 32 is actually becoming more gardens. But the crafting time is only 60 seconds instead of 1,000. So despite this inefficiency, it's actually much faster. And then, what happens if you've got a lot of the gardens you don't want? Well, you can add uranium-235 and take the 2 gardens you don't want and turn them into the garden you do want. So that's kind of an interesting way of transforming them. I think that covers most of it. Of course, you can compost them if you want to, but it's probably not the smartest thing to do with these gardens because they're kind of really valuable. Out of all of the items you work with, they have a very high value for even a single garden, so you kind of don't want to be doing that kind of thing. I think I got most things. Let's check to see if, with seeds, there's only those 2 ways of making the seeds. Plus taking something you've grown and turning that into seeds, which applies to most things. And the plant life can be generated between those 2 methods, where either you get half seeds and plant life, or all plant life and no seeds. Okay, so how are we doing? Research is continuing, but it looks like it's about to stop. Well, I guess it's kind of going. It's agricultural packs have disappeared here, but they're still here, but they're waiting for the packs to make it down for it all to be used up. So I don't know, we might use a little bit there. But we'll plan our setup based on having access to these better types of farms, and we'll just upgrade them as we are able. So we need to plan with Hellmod to make this setup. Now it doesn't need to be very big, but it's kind of a little complicated. So we should plan it in Hellmod here. Well, the first thing we need to do is generate gardens, because we've got nothing. And since there's so many things here, let's just search garden to narrow it down a bit. So we need to generate our gardens from nothing. To make temperate requires the compost and fertilizer. Swamp is soil and fertilizer and viscous mud water. And garden is sand, fertilizer, and saline water. So we'll just hit all of these. I'm not sure exactly how much of each one we'd want, but we will set them to their unique farm type so they're faster. And upgrade them as we have access to them. And not sure about numbers, but let's just say one farm and kind of see what it does. We might have to adjust these numbers later. And this is going to require, you know, compost, fertilizer, soil, yada, yada, yada. Let's get the whole setup figured out, and then we can come back and kind of figure out all those numbers. I mean, it doesn't produce them very fast. So you see here that these numbers are so small. 0.1, like it's not 0.1 per second. It's 0.2 per minute because it's rounding up. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense, you know, 5 minutes to make a garden. But we can find out exactly how many of these farms we would need if we take it a step further. And really, since we're going to be generating gardens, we don't need to keep doing this forever. This is only to get the process started. So this is kind of temporary in a way. So let's leave it there and start a new one. Because essentially what we want to do here is generate seeds. But we only need to do it basically until we have the appropriate number of seeds. So we probably want to set this up to generate gardens and then turn them into seeds and get some plant life. But the problem is if we're making seeds, we're only getting 16 plant life samples back, which is not enough to generate gardens. So we kind of need to use all of these methods in order to make gardens. So the way that they would be grown is with this method here. And we could probably just multiply this by 3, since each one basically requires the same thing. They even require all mineralized water. So to make it simpler, let's just make the one garden and then multiply everything, because I think it'll be a little difficult to calculate otherwise. But we can say one garden for now, just to get some numbers. So you see this requires an input of plant life and gives us an output of gardens. So if we come back out here, and the input of plant life comes from grinding up the gardens, we're going to need 12.5 seed extractors. So these seed extractors are very slow. You might not have expected that, where one farm needs 12.5 seed extractors to be a perfect ratio, but that's kind of how it is. And then we come back here, and it's all balanced out, where the only input we need is the alien fertilizer and the mineralized water. But it's kind of rounding down here, because no outputs up here, but if you look at the actual products and ingredients, the product is 2 gardens per minute, but the ingredients is 1.9. So we're actually generating gardens, but because these numbers are so small, they're not really showing up. So let's add a 0 on here. So that makes that 10 gardens to 125 seed extractors. Not that we necessarily need that much, but now you see how it makes this appear up here. So now that we have an output, we can come in here, grab that garden, and this is the excess. So these farms are making the gardens. These farms are turning them into plant life so they can make more gardens, and it creates a small amount of extra. And those extras can be turned into seeds and also more plant life to make the process go faster. So we'll lock this by the input. So it grabs the garden, 8.4 seed extractors, and we come back and now we have an output of a small amount of plant life, small amount of seeds. And now these numbers are very small, so it's not 0.1 per second, but it's like 2.5 per minute, 1.9 per minute, that kind of thing. Small amount of input of those other things. And basically this would be times 3. One for each garden type, but the ingredients are quite similar. So now the question is, how much plant life samples do we actually want to create? Because that's kind of what we're doing all this for. The seeds are nice, but once we have all of the available seeds, we can just change this setup to grind everything into plant life samples and then just use those. Well, looks like this setup is just about done. But we kind of made this setup based on 3 per second. That's probably way too many. But let's just say, what is 3 per second going to look like? So we do the biome planner, say we want 3. Well, that's 3 alien plant lives per second. It's probably going to be too many because we already bumped this up to 10. So that's only a fraction of what it would need to be. But this setup can run all of the time, and I just don't think we need that much of these packs. I mean, they certainly keep going down the tree where you keep needing them for bigger and bigger things. I guess eventually they end up, but I mean, there's a lot that it goes into it. And, you know, some of these things get pretty high in requirements, but we're not going to be doing research that often. So this setup can run for a long time. I kind of don't want to go nuts and make this big setup. So really the minimum size of the setup, as far as being efficient here, is just to have one farm. One farm growing the gardens, and then the 12.5 grinding them up into plant life, and then roughly 1, but that's pretty close to perfect ratio there, taking the extras, turning them into seeds, and more plant life, giving us an output of plant life. And this whole process will get started by these 3 farms here and their random inputs. And then we can adjust this setup later once we have all of the available seeds. So setting it up to work properly is going to be a little tricky, and we're probably going to do a lot of direct inserting. And what I mean by that is, instead of having like a series of machines and you have like a belt coming down, like let's say that was gardens, and then you'd have inserters. Well, the problem there is that you have a lot of gardens on the belts, and that's going to take a long time to seed. So to avoid that problem, we can kind of do direct insertion via chests or something similar. So the spacing is a little weird here, but if we set things up like this, and this is just an example, they wouldn't be using these assemblers, but you can have them go directly from a chest like this. And then you can have long-handed inserters between each one. And then you would set this inserter to only run if this chest had nothing in it. So the second the chest has one garden, it stops. So this could be a way of absolutely minimizing the number of any type of resource that are on a belt. So that's kind of like, it's kind of like a pseudo belt or a virtual belt, where the belt is technically there, but it's a chain of inserters instead of an actual moving belt. So that's a way that we can build it to use less gardens overall and get seeded faster. So now we need to kind of figure out the input resources here. We can get rid of this biome planner there. But it's basically this times 3. And it's not very much. Just requires this alien fertilizer and some mineralized water. And that mineralized water is so low that I'm sure the factory could supply that with no extra input on our side. This is going to be a little different, but it's also going to be temporary. So we probably don't need to put too much thought into that. So I'm thinking we can probably build all of this more or less on site and just deal with it. So let's see. So we've got our one of each type. We are going to need saline water, and instead of like 2 saline water a second, instead of dealing with that being attached to the rest of the factory, let's just not bother and generate it right on site. So we'll make it from thin mud water, which adds a thin mud water requirement, but we need wash sand, so we'll do that one next, because it's also made from thin mud water. So put that in there. So now we have thin mud water requirement, so we'll get that from light. And then the light comes from concentrated. The concentrated comes from heavy. And the heavy comes from the viscous, which combines with the other viscous that we needed, and it requires the tiniest amount from a pump. This does generate some mud. It's almost certainly not going to be enough, but we'll see. Compost is being made from other parts of the factory, and since it's not needed for this section right here, let's just use a drone to deliver it, and then just remove the drone path when it's not required anymore. Because this fertilizer, alien fertilizer, is going to be made from chemicals, and it's not going to require any compost at all, while this setup does require some. So we're going to need to make this soil. We probably could set it up here too, but let's not worry about that. It does require a couple machines, which is a little annoying. It'll use up the mud that's available, so we'll have to send mud here, which we have drones to do. We have drones for the compost. And then water and fertilizer. As far as the fertilizer is concerned, it probably goes into a lot of things, as you would imagine. All this stuff here. So it seems like the kind of thing that would be on drones. So we'll probably put it on drones. And with that, this setup is complete. There's really not much to it. It's just a lot of tiny machines working a very small amount of time to generate these gardens. And then once the setup has enough gardens to operate, it just won't run anymore. Although I guess we could leave it running to get more gardens, but it'll be self-sustaining, so we won't have to worry about that. But we do need to generate this alien fertilizer here. And to make these numbers correct, let's just make this 3, because it'll be 1 farm for each garden type, so we can generate all of our seeds. Just so we know the exact number of alien fertilizer. And let's also check what this alien fertilizer goes into. Well, not a lot. I mean, it does go into the desert gardens. And another thing you can do is you can actually grow trees with it, so you can create the rare tree types from alien plant life and this fertilizer. And you can also basically grow trees from trees. So you won't have to just keep finding trees, but you can just make them on your own. So it has a few uses, but they're probably not that important, at least right now. So let's just set this up to work with the gardens, and then hopefully whatever that setup is will be big enough for any future purposes. And if it's not, we can visit it. The seed generation is high enough that it shows up here, but all these are being generated. It's just the numbers are too small to show up as an output. But we need this alien fertilizer, which really doesn't require that much of an assembly machine. It requires regular fertilizer, which we'll make from chemicals. And yeah, these numbers are quite small. So I imagine that nitric acid, 2 per second. We almost certainly are creating that. We're probably creating more like 50 or 100. And ammonia gas. Ammonia is getting to the point where we need it for so many processes that we might really want to consider putting that on a pipe bus. But since ammonia can be generated from blue algae here, which is a great way of getting rid of our extra sulfuric wastewater, which we're just getting rid of here and clarifying, we probably want to wait on putting ammonia on the bus until we're producing it this method, which really isn't that far in the future. Really, we just need our blue science, and then boom, there we go. One problem though is we won't be able to make algae farm 4s, and you have to be careful about these recipes, because you see that the blue algae can only be made in algae farm 4. So we'll need titanium in the next tier of logic board. So that's probably gonna have to be put off for a little bit. But still, I don't necessarily want to put ammonia gas on a bus right now, so we'll probably just have to produce this locally. But whatever. We'll also need urea gas, which is carbon dioxide and also ammonia, and small numbers all around. Carbon dioxide will be in the pipe bus, and we need a chemical plant for this. We need our nitrogen from compressed air. Lots of tiny numbers. So basically 1 to 1 to 1 for everything. So we'll deal with that. But in doing so, we will generate our alien fertilizer. The only other thing we're going to need here is this alien goo, which we get from alien bacteria. It's also a very small number. So do we have 0.2 alien bacteria per second? Probably. Oh yes, 180. Now this setup is sized for making crystals, but I think we can leech a tiny bit off of that and just let any inefficiencies happen. Okay, so we're pretty good there. Well, let's see. The first thing we should probably do is build the initial garden generators here, because we need to create gardens to start the whole process. We don't have those special farm types yet, so we'll just use the basic farms and upgrade them when we can. Oh, interesting, there's a bug in here. C4 plump placeholder, but I know what it means. So we're pretty good. We'll just need to make a few washing plants, and we probably want to do that because, yeah, it requires a lot of steel pipes, but I don't know if those are on the bus or not. Probably not, since we don't make that many of them. It's kind of an annoying thing to handcraft, but I also kind of don't want to put them on the bus, so it's funny. It looks like we're stuck at 99%. Oh well. Just need to make some farms, which are a little awkward to make because they require soil, and that's not something you normally carry around with you. So let's grab some fistfuls of it. I think some of these things needed to be upgraded to washing plant 2. Yeah, all these are 1, but I kind of don't want to sit here handcrafting all of them, especially when they seem to work just fine. So I'm going to leave them there. And I added Nixie tubes to most warehouses and pipe systems that are relevant. So instead of having to hover over everything and see a small number, it's a little easier to see, just to make diagnosing the factory easier. Well, this setup can go anywhere, so we might as well just build it here locally so we can make it look nice and then pick it up with bots and put it where we want later. So right here is an example of the Nixie tubes for the liquid storage, where I just divided the chemical by 500, so if it holds 50,000, that'll give us 0 to 100, and then that's just the capacity. And I don't know if it would say 100, but it's probably rounding since there's not enough digits. But 99 is basically 100, so you can see that some of these tanks are supposed to be full as much as they can be. So they're at basically 100%. Well, other ones are limited with logic, so they're like at 80%. So that might be a little easier than hovering over it and being like, all right, how big is the tank? Okay, what's the logic set at? Might be a little easier just to see those numbers, so I did those changes there. Well, these don't need to be set up with any kind of direct insertion or anything, because it's just to seed the system. So it's fine if it runs a little too long. It's not really taking much from the factory here. And one other thing is to make sure is that we have enough fertilizer. We actually don't, because this generates 0.2 fertilizer, but this setup will actually require like a 2.7. Although it's only temporary, if we make it with the fertilizer from this being perfectly balanced, we will have very little fertilizer. So that's not great. So we probably want to beef this up a bit. Let's kind of jump out of there. Come back. Make the necessary fertilizer. Make the goo. And then that separates this fertilizer here. And we're going to use the balance from this side. So let's go over here. We'll say fertilizer. And then it'll be fertilizer from chemicals. So yeah, that makes these numbers a little bigger. As far as nitric acid, let's make sure this number matches. It sure seems like it would. But per second here, we're getting 131, which is more than enough. And I noticed that that was set to per minute, so let's make sure that this goo is set correctly. Alright, so it's making 3 goo per second. and this setup requires 0.2. So although the discrepancy is not quite so wide, it's still more than enough. So we need to make this fertilizer so we can do the urea gas, which also requires ammonia. So we have those two ammonias. So then we can make them and go down the chain of nitrogen. And the hydrogen and oxygen can just come from the factory in general. So let's see here. This is pretty good, but let's bump the numbers a little bit more. Just make that 4. And that seems pretty good. So that will create 3 fertilizer per second. And that's the end of this episode. On the next one, we're going to build this chemical fertilizer and do some other upgrades in preparation for growing gardens. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.